In a forgotten Ohio workshop, one silent mechanic built a machine the U.S. military swore could never exist. When war ignited the skies, his secret design became America's last chance, but his name vanished from the records. Behind every victory, every scream of a jet engine, lived a genius the world was never meant to remember. Now, decades later, a hidden blueprint has resurfaced, and the truth is more dangerous than the myth. This is the story the history books tried to bury. The hangars never really slept. In the late 1930 seconds, they breathed, exhaling smog, oil vapor, and the metallic tang of restless ambition. In America's industrial heartland, factories glowed into the night like furnaces of intent, yet much of that intent was stuck in yesterday's thinking. The Great Depression still clung to people's habits, even as political storms rolled across Europe and the Pacific. Washington debated budgets and neutrality, newspapers tracked dictators and invasions, and the military clung to aging aircraft designs that felt safe, proven, and comfortably familiar. In a world that was clearly accelerating towards something dark and unpredictable, American aviation in many corners was still anchored to the past. Inside one aging hangar on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, the past and future quietly collided over a cluttered workbench. The place was supposed to be just another maintenance bay, another stop on the slow assembly line of routine inspections and conservative thinking. Yet in one corner, beneath a crooked lamp and amid a spread of hand-drawn sketches, sat a man who refused to accept that the sky had limits defined by committees. Earl Whitman, a self-taught mechanic with grease-stained hands and second-hand textbooks, had turned his small corner into a laboratory of stubborn imagination. Earl did not come from any of the schools whose names were whispered with respect in Washington. There were no polished degrees hanging above his bench, only yellowed pages from engineering manuals, aviation magazines, and exotic foreign journals he'd traded for with pilots passing through. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and asked questions that made senior engineers uncomfortable. Where others saw tested and certified designs, he saw wasted potential, overly generous safety margins, and drag stealing speed from wings that could be sharper, leaner, more alive in the air. The official designers, brought in for inspections or special projects, dismissed him with a practiced ease. To them, he was the classic overconfident mechanic, the kind who tinkered too much and belonged under the orders of educated men. They saw the extra rivet holes in his experimental panels and shook their heads. They glanced at his hand-built airflow rigs, makeshift wind tunnels, patched together from old fans and scrap, and smiled in that way people do when they are certain they're smarter than the person they're judging. To the establishment, Earl wasn't just uncredentialed, he was reckless, the sort of mind that might one day get someone court-martialed over a broken wing. Yet the pilots, especially the younger test flyers passing through Ohio on ferry assignments, saw something else. They noticed how Earl ran his fingers along a wing spar, as if reading its hidden language. They recognized the quiet intensity in the way he tracked every vibration, every odd sound on takeoff and landing. They felt his unfiltered obsession with speed and precision, his instinctive understanding that a fraction of a second in the air could be the difference between making it home and never being found. While senior officers grumbled about regulations, a few daring pilots started lingering near his bench, watching him sketch curves that looked unlike anything they'd flown. For Earl, the obsession went beyond speed as a thrill. He saw speed as a form of protection, a shield made of time and distance. He understood that with storm clouds gathering overseas, any future war would not be won by the slow or the complacent. He studied the rare photographs of cutting-edge European aircraft, tracing their silhouettes late into the night, comparing them to America's conservative designs. He filled notebooks with calculations on lift, drag, compressibility, and structural stress long before those terms became common in military briefings. In his mind, aircraft were not just machines. They were promises waiting to be kept, if only someone dared to allow them to reach their full potential. His methods, however, unnerved almost everyone. He drilled holes where others insisted metal should remain solid. He shaved down fairings, experimenting with shapes that standard manuals didn't bless. He adjusted control surfaces, not because someone told him to, but because his intuition and endless measurements suggested there was more efficiency to be found. Supervisors called his modifications unnecessary, risky, even disrespectful to the engineers who had signed off on those planes. Rumors circulated that if he kept playing engineer, he'd be written up, transferred, or quietly pushed out of the hangar culture that tolerated quirks only up to a point. The ridicule was subtle but relentless. Jokes about Professor Whitman floated across the hangar floor. Senior mechanics walked past his bench with exaggerated care, as if his designs might explode on contact with ordinary reason. Still, a few pilots ignored the snickering. They volunteered for test runs after he had made discreet adjustments, never anything dangerous, but always something different. They noticed shorter takeoff rolls, smoother climbs, marginally better fuel economy. The changes were small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. But in the cockpit, where every sensation mattered, those pilots could feel the aircraft respond in ways that official reports never captured. Late in 1938, as radio bulletins spilled news about Europe's deepening crisis, the quiet tension inside the hangar began to mirror the tension in the world outside. Orders came down for reviews of readiness, whispers floated about possible rearmament, and suddenly everyone talked about speed as if they'd invented the concern themselves. Yet the official process moved slowly, trapped in procurement cycles and political caution. Earl, stuck in the same corner, watched these changes with a hardening resolve. The future was rushing toward them, and the aircraft he loved were not ready for what was coming. He felt it in his bones. One night, long after most of the crew had gone home and the hangar had settled into its usual chorus of distant trucks and humming transformers, Earl stayed behind with a stack of sketches and a nagging idea he couldn't shake. The air outside was cold, the kind that sharpened thoughts instead of dulling them. He adjusted his lamp, spread out his notes on experimental airfoils and control profiles, and began redrawing a concept he'd been refining in the margins for months, maybe years. Line by line, calculation by calculation, something familiar began to look radically new. As he stepped back from the bench and stared at a configuration no official blueprint had ever shown, he realized this was no longer just an improvement, it was a challenge to the entire way America thought about military aircraft. He understood, in that breathless moment, that if his design worked, it would not simply make planes slightly faster or more efficient, it would redefine how they climbed, how they turned, how they survived at the edge of the unknown. It was an idea big enough to demand attention from people who wanted him gone. Standing alone in the dim light of the hangar, Earl Whitman knew he had crossed a line from tinkering into revolution. What he did next would determine whether his discovery remained a forgotten sketch on a grease-stained workbench or became the most disruptive leap in U.S. aviation the establishment had ever been forced to confront. The U.S. Army Air Corps prided itself on order, predictability, and the reassuring geometry of established doctrine. In the late 1932, when the world edged closer to global conflict, the service remained rooted in a structure built more for administration than innovation. Technical manuals were treated as gospel, procurement processes as immovable rituals, and chain of command authority as the final word on what an aircraft could or should be. Inside this slow-moving machine, where new ideas often suffocated under forms and signatures, Earl Whitman found himself pushing against a wall that never seemed to crack. Every time a proposal crossed his bench, he could see the missed opportunities, the outdated assumptions, the blind spots in thinking that assumed the next war would look like the last. To the establishment, reliability mattered more than ambition. But to him, ambition was the only way to survive what was coming. His clashes with military engineers intensified as his ideas grew sharper. They called his designs unsafe, a word they leaned on when they wanted a quick dismissal without deeper scrutiny. They studied his sketches with the same expression used for spotting structural fatigue, as if his imagination were a defect waiting to cause disaster. He tried to explain the aerodynamics, how reducing weight in specific sections could increase maneuverability without jeopardizing structural integrity, how airflow changes in war conditions demanded bolder designs, but the engineers waved him off. They believed they had already perfected the formula. They measured him not by the accuracy of his calculations, but by the absence of traditional credentials behind his name. Their authority shielded them from doubt, and their disdain only hardened his resolve. Still, Earl never let the rejection slow him down. Instead, it fueled an obsession that grew more intense by the week. He wanted to build something lighter, faster, and deadlier than anything the Air Corps had even considered. He believed that a future aerial battlefield would be a place of speed, violent bursts of movement, narrow escapes, and survival hinging on fractions of seconds. Heavy aircraft built for stability would be liabilities. Slow turns would mean vulnerability. And while official designers polished incremental upgrades, Earl was thinking in leaps. He envisioned a fighter that could cut through air with the precision of a blade. The idea consumed him so completely that even when the hangar lights dimmed and the machinery went quiet, his mind stayed loud with possibilities. To chase those possibilities, he needed a place untouched by regulation. So he built one. At the far end of the airfield, beyond a row of storage sheds that no one bothered to patrol after dark, Earl found an abandoned workshop used years earlier for repairing obsolete biplanes. The roof leaked, the floorboards groaned, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up, but to him it was perfect. It was a place where his ideas could exist without interference. Night after night, after finishing his official duties, he slipped inside with boxes of scrap metal, discarded parts, and surplus equipment the Air Corps no longer tracked. Slowly, the forgotten workshop transformed into a laboratory of defiance. The prototypes that emerged from his hands were rough but purposeful. Some were miniature models, carved from salvaged aluminum sheets. Others were full-size panel mock-ups, showing how a wing edge could be shaped to reduce turbulence in sharp banking maneuvers. He built airflow rigs powered by mismatched fans and tested the prototypes using smoke trails made from chemicals a friend in supply quietly provided. There were nights when he worked until dawn, analyzing how each adjustment changed performance. He wasn't simply guessing, he was testing, recording, refining. His notebooks filled with sketches and calculations, each page capturing the evolution of a design that no official engineer wanted to touch. But secrets are never entirely safe on a military airfield. Word of his nighttime activities spread quietly, carried by whispers between mechanics, sideways glances from officers, and reports written by supervisors who resented his independence. The tension between Earl and his superiors grew heavy enough to feel in the air. They accused him of misusing materials, of overstepping authority, of acting like an engineer when he was only authorized to be a mechanic. Meetings became interrogations disguised as performance reviews. The warnings came slowly at first, then more sharply, as if the machine of bureaucracy sensed a threat and closed ranks to crush it. One senior officer, a man known for his rigid adherence to procedure, called him into the office and made it clear his night work had to stop. The officer framed it as a matter of discipline, order, and respect for established systems. But Earl recognized the fear behind the arguments. The machine was not just indifferent to new ideas, it was terrified of them. Every part of the Air Corps' internal structure was designed to prevent deviations, innovations, or risks that weren't approved through official channels. And since Earl wasn't part of those channels, his work was treated as rebellion. The message was unmistakable. If he didn't fall in line, his career would end before it ever truly began. The threat only deepened his obsession. He felt the countdown in his bones, sensing that the world was approaching a crossroads where innovation would no longer be optional. Every aircraft he saw rolling out of the official manufacturing lines confirmed his fears they were too slow, too heavy, too reliant on outdated assumptions. It frustrated him to the point where sleep felt like a waste of precious time. He worked harder, pushing his secret designs further, refining the shape of wings and the structure of lightweight frames. He believed that if he could build a functioning prototype, even a partial one, it would be undeniable proof that the Air Corps was thinking too small. Yet each step forward increased the risk of discovery. Supervisors checked his work more aggressively. Officers lingered around the hangars at odd hours. Even the pilots who admired his ideas warned him that the pressure was mounting. Some suggested he should halt the secret project before someone made an example of him. But fear had never guided him. Challenge had. and the more pressure he felt, the more determined he became to finish what he started. Then, one night, as he stood in the dim workshop adjusting a newly rebuilt airflow rig, the creaking of the old wooden door snapped him from his concentration. Footsteps entered, steady and confident, accompanied by the faint smell of leather gloves and cold night air. Earl turned, expecting a supervisor ready to file the final report condemning his career. Instead, he saw an officer he didn't recognize, one whose expression didn't carry the usual skepticism. The officer studied the prototypes, the notes, the makeshift testing equipment, and instead of reprimand, there was something else in his eyes. Something closer to recognition, maybe even curiosity. And in that quiet moment, with the workshop trembling in the wind, Earl Whitman realized that this unexpected visitor might change everything, because not everyone in the Air Corps saw madness where he saw possibility. Captain Roy Harding entered Earl Whitman's hidden workshop with the quiet confidence of someone who had already made peace with breaking rules. Unlike the officers who clung to procedure, Harding carried a reputation for unorthodox thinking, earned through years of challenging assumptions about what the Air Corps considered acceptable risk. He was young for his rank, sharp-minded, and unafraid to question the slow machinery of military tradition. Where others saw Earl's secret prototypes as dangerous improvisation, Harding saw the outline of an idea that could reshape the very future of aerial combat. Their meeting was not a confrontation, it was a beginning. In those early nights of collaboration, their partnership formed around shared defiance. Harding studied the sketches with a pilot's eye, tracing the contours of wings that promised tighter turns, faster climbs, and dramatic reductions in energy loss. He understood instantly what the senior engineers had missed. Earl was not trying to undermine the Air Corps. He was trying to drag it, unwilling as it was, into the future. Harding began bringing technical data from classified tests, reports Earl had never been allowed to see, and statistics on European fighters quietly surpassing American models. Together, they analyzed each figure, searching for weaknesses they could solve with the bold design forming on the workshop's central table. Their collaboration soon evolved into a relentless rhythm. Earl approached each problem as a mechanic determined to outthink his tools, while Harding approached it as a pilot determined to survive the skies predicted by the next war. The design they refined, still only a series of experimental components, began taking shape around three radical philosophies: strip excess weight wherever physics allowed, reimagine airflow from wingtip to tail, and build an engine cooling system that would enable the aircraft to run harder and longer without catastrophic overheating. The notion felt audacious in a military culture used to cautious improvements, yet both men understood that anything less radical would be obsolete before it even left the ground. Earl's experiments with lighter alloys became the backbone of the design. He salvaged metals from crates the Air Corps had written off as unusable, then tested them in controlled compression rigs he engineered from spare hydraulic parts. Some alloys buckled under stress, while others showed surprising flexibility. Each failure taught them how to balance resilience with reduced weight. Harding's eyes often widened at the results, not because the materials were miraculous, but because Earl had managed to coax them into configurations official engineers insisted were impossible. The lighter frames allowed for faster acceleration, reduced drag, and sharper maneuvering traits Harding knew could mean survival in dogfights none of the generals seemed able to imagine. Equally groundbreaking was their work on aerodynamics. Earl's sketches grew increasingly complex as he experimented with wing shapes that rejected the traditional straight edges favored by the Air Corps. He envisioned surfaces that guided airflow rather than tolerated it, curves that reduced turbulence, and control flaps placed in unconventional positions to improve responsiveness. He built wooden mock-ups, tested them with smoke channels, then refined the angles again and again until Harding could practically feel the aircraft's behavior in his mind. The young captain often stood at the workshop door, imagining what such a machine might achieve at altitude, how it could climb past enemy fighters, slip out of danger, or strike before the opposition could react. But perhaps the most daring innovation emerged from their discussions about engine cooling. Harding, having studied the failures of overseas aircraft in long-range tests, knew overheating was the Achilles heel of high-performance fighters. Earl proposed a solution that combined mechanical creativity with insights he had gathered from years of repairing engines pushed beyond their limits. He developed a cooling system that redistributed airflow through the fuselage in a way that reduced temperature spikes without sacrificing speed. It was a deeply technical, unorthodox method that no regulation manual would ever endorse, yet Harding recognized its brilliance immediately. If implemented properly, it could grant the aircraft unprecedented endurance in combat. Their progress, however, existed in constant tension with the institutional forces working against them. Funding was impossible to secure through official channels, so Harding diverted small allocations from overlooked maintenance budgets, always careful to leave no trace. Earl scavenged materials from scrap piles, discarded prototypes, and forgotten storage units. They worked in shadows, unable to reveal their design for fear it would be rejected simply because it came from outside. Sanctioned authority. Rumors began circulating among officers who noticed Harding's unusual hours, and supervisors became increasingly suspicious of Earl's improved craftsmanship. Every step forward felt like a victory stolen from a system determined to keep them in place. Sabotage came not from a saboteur, but from bureaucracy itself. Requests for parts went missing. Tool inventories were altered. The airflow rig Earl had built was accidentally removed during a surprise inspection and returned damaged. Even Harding felt pressure from above, subtle warnings about his associations, inquiries into his schedule, and cautions that ambitious officers often ruined their careers by pursuing fantastical ideas. The Air Corps was tightening its grip, sensing change at its edges. Earl and Harding pressed on anyway, driven by something stronger than approval. The conviction that the sky's future demanded courage the institution did not yet possess. Yet beneath their determination, Earl carried an internal conflict that grew heavier as their design neared viability. Loyalty to the Air Corps had shaped his career. It was the uniformed world that had given him a chance when the Depression left many with none, but legacy tugged at him with equal force. He knew that staying obedient meant watching the next war unfold with aircraft unprepared for its brutality. Innovation demanded rebellion, and rebellion felt like betrayal. He wrestled with that truth each night as he tightened bolts on a prototype that might cost him everything he owed to the uniform he respected. When the day finally came to begin early testing on the combined components, tension hung in the workshop like a storm waiting to break. Harding arrived before dawn, carrying a folder of data they needed to calibrate the engine tests. Earl set up instruments, tightened final fittings, and checked each measurement twice. The prototype wasn't complete, but it was functional enough to test airflow, structural stability, and engine responsiveness. If these tests succeeded, their design would no longer be theoretical, it would be real. As the engine rig powered up, the first vibrations coursed through the floorboards. Earl monitored the gauges, adjusting airflow valves to prevent pressure spikes. Harding watched the readings with a mix of anticipation and cautious hope. For a moment, everything aligned, the airflow smoothed, the temperature held steady, and the engine delivered power beyond anything they had projected. But before Earl could lock in the settings, a sudden warning flickered across the gauge panel. Something inside the system had gone unstable. The engine emitted a low, ominous shudder, followed by a rising whine that did not belong in any controlled test. Earl reached for the manual shutoff, but the malfunction accelerated faster than either of them anticipated. A critical component, one they'd reinforced but never fully tested at this intensity, began to fail. Harding stepped forward, shouting for Earl to move back, but neither could stop what was coming. In the split second before the rig tore itself apart, Earl felt the crushing realization that their dream, months of labor, sacrifice, and defiance might end not with recognition or reform, but with the catastrophic collapse of the very machine meant to prove their vision. And as the workshop filled with the roar of a system spiraling out of control, Earl Whitman understood that this explosion of failure might not only destroy the prototype, but take his future with it. The morning of the test flight unfolded beneath an uncertain sky, the kind that shifted colors with the impatience of a world waiting for answers. Dawn light spilled across the airfield, casting long metallic reflections along the fuselage of the unfinished prototype. Mechanics moved with cautious steps, their expressions holding a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They knew this aircraft was unlike anything the Air Corps had ever sanctioned, a machine shaped not by committees, but by the relentless will of Earl Whitman. For all its promise, it remained an unproven experiment facing the unforgiving arena of open air. And as Earl stepped onto the flight line, He understood he wasn't testing a machine. He was confronting the very boundary between possibility and consequence. Captain Roy Harding stood beside him, reviewing the final numbers with a seriousness that matched the gravity of the moment. They were supposed to wait for approval, wait for senior officers to grant a test. Flight window, wait for paperwork that would take weeks to crawl through channels. But waiting had never built anything worth remembering. Harding believed in the design enough to take the risk, and Earl believed in the design enough to climb into the cockpit himself. He didn't trust anyone else with its first breath of sky. The aircraft, light and unpolished, seemed almost too fragile for its purpose. Yet inside its riveted panels lived every calculation and sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. The engine came alive with a hesitant growl, then steadied into a focused, unfamiliar hum. It vibrated with the raw temperament of a creature not yet tamed, but Earl felt its rhythm settle against the seat frame. He scanned the gauges, each needle quivering like a nervous heartbeat. The runway ahead shimmered in the rising heat, a long path that promised answers none of them were ready for. Harding gave a firm nod as he stepped back, signaling the start of a test flight. No. Regulation Office had approved. Earl tightened his grip on the controls and released the brake. Acceleration came quickly, sharper than projected, and the aircraft lurched forward with an eagerness that surprised even Earl. For a moment, the world narrowed into a tunnel of motion and vibration. The prototype shook under the strain of untested aerodynamics, yet climbed with a grace he had only imagined on paper. The ground fell away as the machine lifted into its first fragile ascent. Earl felt weightlessness blend with exhilaration, and for a brief instant, he allowed himself to believe the impossible might be within reach. But the sky does not bend easily to ambition. At 200 feet, a sudden irregular tremor rippled through the airframe. The controls stiffened, the engine temperature spiked. Earl recognized the signs before the alarms began their shrill warning. The same unstable component that nearly destroyed the workshop rig was failing again, now under forces infinitely more unforgiving. He tried to level the wings, coaxing the aircraft into a controlled glide, but the prototype fought him, oscillating with unpredictable force. Each movement demanded absolute focus, as if gravity itself had singled him out for a reckoning. Wind buffeted the lightweight structure, amplifying every flaw in its hurried construction. Earl adjusted airflow valves, throttled back, recalibrated trim, but the aircraft reacted with a stubborn severity that signaled the start of a deeper malfunction. A sharp jolt tore through the fuselage, and the nose dipped violently. The ground surged upward in a blur of earth and terror. Earl felt the sickening drop in his stomach, the realization that no calculation could fully prepare him for the way failure behaved when given altitude. He fought against the descent with everything he had learned in his long nights of designing, but the prototype had crossed into its breaking point. The crash was not a violent explosion, but a crushing collapse of momentum and metal. The aircraft slammed into the far end of the field, skidding through dust and debris before coming to a mangled halt along the grass. Earl remained conscious long enough to register the wrenching sensation of the cockpit frame twisting inward, trapping him beneath its weight. Smoke drifted around him in thin, acrid threads, and the world seemed to tilt sideways as sounds grew distant. He tasted dust and oil on the air, felt the throb of impact pulsing through his bones, and understood how close he had come to vanishing into a forgotten footnote of ambition. Rescue crews rushed across the field, shouting orders, pulling him from the wreckage with careful urgency. Pain gripped his ribs and shoulder, but consciousness clung to him with a stubborn determination that matched his own. Through the haze, he saw Harding pushing through the crowd with a look that held equal parts relief, frustration, and dread. The crash had not only damaged the prototype, had given the Air Corps the perfect reason to shut the project down. Within hours, Earl was confined to a medical cot, where officers lined up to reprimand him with rehearsed sternness. They cited regulations, safety protocols, unauthorized flight procedures, and the embarrassment of damaging equipment during an unapproved test. Some expressed disappointment. Others concealed satisfaction behind bureaucratic phrasing. They told him the project was over, that development would cease immediately, and that continued pursuit of his design would jeopardize what remained of his career. But lying there, battered yet stubbornly conscious, Earl felt no inclination to surrender. The crash had revealed flaws, yes, but flaws were data. Flaws meant the design had lived long enough to show its weaknesses. And weakness could be corrected. The idea, the vision, the aircraft's potential, none of it had died in the wreckage. He refused to abandon a dream that had nearly carried him into the sky. Pressure thickened around him in the days that followed. Officers demanded reports. Engineers dismissed him with renewed superiority. Harding was placed under quiet scrutiny, his loyalty questioned behind closed doors. Bureaucracy tightened its grip, intent on smothering a project it never wanted to acknowledge. Yet Earl's resolve grew sharper with every attempt to silence him. The crash had stripped away illusions, leaving behind only the essential truth that innovation would never thrive in a system built to avoid risk. Earl was preparing to draft a new series of modifications when a courier strode into the infirmary with an envelope bearing the urgency of a world already changing. The telegram was brief, stamped with government authority, and delivered without ceremony. But its message hit with more force than the crash that had nearly ended him. America was entering the war. The telegram struck with the force of history, shifting beneath America's feet. Overnight, the country that had argued for neutrality awoke to a new reality, one that demanded speed, power, and aircraft capable of shaping the course of an unpredictable war. The shockwaves that followed rippled through hangars, bases, and command offices, with a momentum that outpaced even the fastest fighters in the arsenal. The nation needed air superiority, and it needed it now. Where only months earlier committees lectured about procedure, they now scrambled for answers. The Air Corps faced a growing truth that could not be softened. The older designs were already struggling to keep pace with enemy advancements. Battles overseas revealed how swiftly the sky could turn from blue to crimson, filled with the streaks of machines designed with ruthless efficiency. In that rush, innovation, once considered disruption, became a matter of survival. Earl Whitman, still recovering from his near-fatal crash, watched the shift unfold from the periphery of official channels. He understood the urgency better than anyone. While the nation's factories converted to wartime production and the Air Corps re-evaluated every aircraft in service, whispers began circulating through headquarters about an unorthodox prototype that had nearly changed the game before its wings ever truly tasted the sky. What had been dismissed as reckless experimentation now returned as a possible salvation. Reluctance lingered, but desperation had a way of reshaping opinions faster than any argument. Senior officers initiated a classified review of Earl's design, combing through the sketches rescued from the wreckage, the test data Harding had carefully preserved, and the calculations dismissed months before. The review board did not offer praise. Instead, they ordered modifications urgent, sweeping, and uncompromising. They asked Earl to assist in redesigning the prototype under strict oversight, reducing any trace of unauthorized innovation while simultaneously demanding extraordinary results. Earl accepted, not out of obedience, but because war had stripped away the luxury of waiting for institutional approval. His design was no longer just an idea. It was a necessity wrapped in steel and speed. Captain Harding returned to his side, officially assigned to monitor the development but unofficially determined to protect the project from the suffocating grip of bureaucracy. Together they worked through nights filled with the sounds of tools, engines, and the pulse of a nation preparing for something far larger than either of them. By the time the first wartime-ready model rolled out of the assembly bay, it looked nothing like the damaged prototype that had once been dismissed as dangerous. This new machine, sleek, sharpened, and strengthened, held the quiet promise of shifting the balance in the skies. The Air Corps refused to deploy it widely, unsure if a radical aircraft could be risked in large formations. Instead, they created a small experimental unit composed of skilled but daring pilots, men whose survival instincts matched their willingness to trust untested ideas. They were assigned to fly the aircraft in limited operations, far from press briefings and official praise. Their mission was simple: survive long enough to prove the aircraft's worth. Earl stood on the airfield the morning the unit launched its first mission. The atmosphere throbbed with urgency, planes humming with the contained energy of new purpose. He watched the pilots strap into the cockpits, their movements efficient but tinged with curiosity. They understood they were stepping into something no manual had prepared them for. The engines snapped to life with a precision. Earl recognized immediately it was the same heartbeat he had tried to capture on his workbench in that forgotten workshop, now refined through battle-driven necessity. When the fighters shot down the runway and lifted into the cold morning sky, they climbed faster than any aircraft Earl had ever seen. It was as though the design had always been waiting for this moment. The first reports from the field reached command within hours. What began as cautious reconnaissance escalated quickly into combat when enemy fighters intercepted the unit over contested territory. Expecting a conventional engagement, the enemy pilots moved in formation, attempting to trap the new American aircraft in predictable maneuvers. But they were met with something entirely unexpected. Earl's design moved with a freedom that stunned both sides. It cut through tight turns without bleeding altitude, accelerated with a ferocity that defied conventional expectations, and executed escape maneuvers so clean that enemy pilots overshot their targets before realizing their mistake. The sky turned red, with the trails of burning engines and emergency flares. In the chaos of battle, the experimental unit found itself rewriting the rules of aerial combat. They outclimbed, outrolled, and outmaneuvered opponents who had dominated the air only weeks earlier. For the first time in months, American forces radioed back with a triumphant urgency that hinted at hope rather than desperation. Officials scrambled to understand how an aircraft once buried under administrative rejection had produced results that surpassed their trusted models. Earl received updates from Harding in clipped, breathless reports. Each victory filled him with a silent, complicated pride. He felt no desire for recognition or medals. The satisfaction came from knowing the machine he had once built in defiance of authority was now safeguarding the pilots who risked everything above the clouds. He watched new squadrons form around the design, each aircraft rolling out of hangars with careful precision. The sight stirred a mix of triumph and responsibility within him. The machine had proven itself in the crucible of war, but success carried its own weight now. It had to keep performing. Lives depended on it. As the victories accumulated, higher command finally acknowledged what had once seemed unthinkable. Earl Whitman's design was not merely viable, it was essential. Production orders increased with sudden urgency. Factories expanded assembly lines dedicated to the fighter. Engineers hastened to understand the innovations they had previously dismissed, and field commanders adjusted their tactics around the aircraft's strengths. The machine had transcended its origins, becoming not just a piece of equipment, but a symbol of adaptation under pressure. Earl watched quietly, knowing every advancement came with new expectations, new fears, and new shadows on the horizon, because war never remained still. Reports began circulating through intelligence channels, whispers at first, then increasingly urgent briefings. Enemy research units were developing something in response, something designed to counter the shocking maneuverability and speed of Earl's creation. Intercepted sketches, recovered fragments, and pilot testimonies all pointed toward the same unsettling truth. The enemy was testing a fighter of unprecedented velocity, engineered specifically to chase down the American aircraft that had reshaped the battlefield. And as Earl studied the classified report placed on his desk, he realized the sky was about to demand even more from him, because somewhere across the front, a faster threat was already rising. Victory in the air did not bring Earl Whitman the respect he had quietly hoped might emerge once the war demanded innovation over hierarchy. Instead, the success of his creation ignited a different battle. One waged not in the skies, but in the dimly lit offices, where envy, ambition, and political maneuvering thrived without restraint. As headlines celebrated the sudden shift in American air dominance, senior officers who had once dismissed Earl's ideas now stepped forward to claim credit for endorsing experimental advancements in aircraft design. They presented themselves as visionaries who had encouraged progress, crafting a narrative that left no space for the mechanic who built the machine with his own hands in a neglected workshop. Whispers circulated among staff that the aircraft's brilliance must have originated from classified departments, not from a man who lacked credentials. A few officers, threatened by the possibility that Earl's success might expose their earlier refusals, worked quietly to erase his influence. Reports were rewritten, signatures replaced, and project notes rearranged to highlight contributions from official channels. When technical journals finally praised the aircraft's aerodynamic superiority, the citations belonged to engineers who had never touched the prototype until the war forced their involvement. In the halls where reputation mattered more than truth, Earl's name became an inconvenience to those who sought glory without having risked anything to earn it. Eventually, the military moved to assume full control of the fighter's legacy. Production expanded, distribution widened, and the aircraft became a symbol of American resilience. But behind the scenes, committees drafted new versions of the project history, polished and convenient, designed to present the fighter as the inevitable result of structured military research. Earl was quietly removed from advisory roles. Meetings that once relied on his input were suddenly held without him, their minutes scrubbed of anything that suggested the design had ever been born outside sanctioned engineering rooms. He watched as the aircraft evolved into a weapon recognized across continents, yet his connection to it faded in official records until it became little more than a footnote. The moment of humiliation came without ceremony. Earl received a directive stating that his presence was no longer required on the technical board overseeing the fighter's continued development. The language was polite, framed as a reassignment to standard mechanical duties. But the message was unmistakable. He had been cut out. Soon afterward, his name vanished from the project roster entirely. It was replaced by titles and teams, none of which had held the wrench, the blueprint, or the imagination that had brought the aircraft into existence. Harding tried to challenge the decision, appealing to superiors and presenting undeniable evidence of Earl's original work. But he discovered quickly that some doors shut tighter in victory than in crisis. Higher command had no interest in revisiting the uncomfortable origins of their prized fighter. They wanted order restored, credit allocated through official paths, and the story told in a way that strengthened institutional prestige. Harding's persistence only endangered his own standing, and Earl, unwilling to drag him into the same quiet punishment, urged him to let it go. When the war finally ended, and the world exhaled with the heavy exhaustion of survival, Earl returned to civilian life without ceremony. There were no parades for mechanics who worked in shadows, no medals for those who changed the tide through ideas rather than rank. He went back to Ohio, to quieter skies and familiar roads. Neighbors saw him as the same reserved man he had always been, unaware that the aircraft dominating post-war documentaries had been shaped by his midnight labor and defiant brilliance. He never corrected them. To him, the war had taken enough without demanding that he trade humility for recognition. Yet in the stillness of post-war days, a deep conflict took root inside him. Innovation had been his compass, a force that pulled him toward progress even when everything around him insisted he turn back. But recognition, he realized, was a different hunger, one he had denied for years but now felt the absence of. He never wanted fame, but erasure carried a weight he struggled to ignore. His aircraft flew across oceans, trained new pilots, and appeared in films documenting the air campaigns of the war. Every time he saw its silhouette, he felt a familiar mix of pride and loss. It was the machine he had built to protect lives in the sky, yet it had cost him his own place in history. Despite the bitterness that lingered at the edges of his memory, Earl refused to grow resentful. He took small jobs repairing farm equipment, occasionally tuning the engines of local delivery planes. Some nights he sat on his porch with old notebooks, the same ones filled with calculations that had once threatened to upend the Air Corps. He reread them, not out of longing, but out of gratitude for the quiet certainty that even if the world had overlooked him, he knew what he had accomplished. Progress had required sacrifice, and he had paid his share. Maybe greatness was never meant to be comfortable. Time moved on. The aircraft he had created was eventually replaced by newer, faster machines, many of them borrowing principles from his original designs. Engineers who had never heard his name cited aerodynamic methods he had pioneered in a workshop no one had bothered to protect. Earl aged quietly, carrying his legacy like a hidden scar protected from the world, yet present in everything that moved through the sky with grace and purpose. Years turned into decades, and the war became a chapter discussed by new generations who never felt the urgency of its fire. Museums grew across the country, each filled with exhibits honoring the machines that helped decide the conflict. One such museum, polished and reverent, displayed a series of early blueprints under protective glass. Visitors admired the bold shapes and innovative curves, unaware of the long nights and silent sacrifices that had carved those lines into existence. Among them, one day, stood a retired pilot who had flown the early experimental models in combat. His hair had thinned, his back had bent with time, but his memory remained sharp. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the familiar curvature of the wings, sketched in black ink. Near the bottom corner of the blueprint, faded but unmistakable, was a signature he had not seen in decades: E. Whitman. And for the first time in years, the truth stirred. Modern fighter jets scream across the sky with a confidence shaped by decades of engineering triumphs, yet tucked beneath their polished complexity lies the quiet imprint of a man most Americans have never heard of. Earl Whitman's ideas, once dismissed as reckless speculation, became the unseen scaffolding of an aviation future he never had the chance to witness. Today's aircraft, armed with thrust-vectoring engines, lightweight composite frames, and aerodynamic philosophies refined through generations, trace their roots back to principles he sketched under the dim light of a forgotten workshop. Even if his name rarely appears in textbooks, the logic of his designs pulses through every high-altitude turn, every evasive maneuver, and every moment when pilots trust their machines to obey instincts sharpened by innovation. In the roar of every modern jet, there lingers a faint echo of a man whose brilliance was too early, too unconventional, and too unprotected to survive in the spotlight. Historians often speak of technological evolution as a straight line, a clean sequence of discoveries supported by noble institutions and celebrated engineers. But Whitman's story disrupts that comfortable narrative. His journey exposed how fragile genius becomes when placed inside rigid systems that fear disruption more than defeat. Long after his aircraft shaped the skies of World War II, long after newer jets replaced the machines inspired by his work, he faded quietly from public memory. The emotional weight of that disappearance stretches across decades, revealing a truth that feels both universal and deeply personal. Innovation, without recognition, leaves a trail of unspoken sorrow. Whitman had never sought applause, yet the erasure stung with a cruelty he carried into old age. To create something extraordinary is a triumph. To watch the world forget the hands that forged it is a wound that rarely heals. Still, the legacy of unacknowledged genius rarely stays buried forever. As the retired pilot stared at the faded signature on the museum blueprint, he began asking questions that had long gone unanswered. His inquiries stirred curiosity among curators, archivists, and younger historians eager to uncover the stories overshadowed by institutional narratives. What began as a simple question, "Who was E. Whitman?" grew into a revived search through storage rooms, classified archives, and dusty records misfiled under outdated project codes. Researchers found fragments of correspondence, technical notes marked in Whitman's meticulous handwriting, and reports that once attempted to redirect praise toward committees rather than individuals. Slowly, the shape of the truth emerged. The fighter design, credited to official departments, had in fact been built on the shoulders of a mechanic whose brilliance had been inconvenient at the time. The rediscovery of his early prototype sealed the shift from curiosity to revelation, buried in a forgotten corner of a government warehouse. The remains of the original test aircraft sat beneath layers of canvas and time. Its frame was scorched, its angles rough, but its bones carried unmistakable signs of Whitman's radical thinking. When restoration experts examined the structure, they recognized aerodynamic features decades ahead of anything the Air Corps had publicly endorsed in the 1,930 seconds. Word spread through academic circles, military museums, and aviation forums, capturing the imaginations of people who understood the magnitude of what Whitman had accomplished with so little support. Suddenly, a man once relegated to footnotes became the center of a conversation about forgotten pioneers, those who risked everything to push boundaries while receiving nothing in return. The emotional weight of this rediscovery resonated beyond engineering discussions. It sparked debates about how societies measure greatness and who deserves a place in the stories told to future generations. Whitman's anonymity offered a sobering reflection. brilliance can thrive in obscurity. And sometimes the most pivotal contributions come from those who labor without rank, title, or political backing. His life became a testament to the complex intersection between defiance and duty, innovation and erasure. He had fought not for glory, but for the survival of the pilots whose safety depended on machines capable of outrunning danger. That selflessness, though unseen for decades, now revealed itself in a new light. As historians pieced together Whitman's work, they found themselves tracing not only the evolution of aircraft, but the emotional undercurrent of a man who had carried both pride and sorrow in equal measure. Whitman had returned from war with a heart weighed down by the contradictions of his legacy, knowing he had shaped aviation's future, yet unable to claim ownership of what he built. The fighter he designed became a foundation for post-war jet development, influencing early swept-wing concepts and airflow theories that later defined the jet age. His fingerprints remained etched into the DNA of machines capable of slicing through the stratosphere, protecting pilots on missions he could scarcely have imagined. But he had lived his final years in silence, the truth buried beneath layers of bureaucracy that valued order over honesty. When the restored prototype was unveiled to a small audience decades after its creation, the ceremony was understated but sincere. Engineers stood beside pilots, historians beside mechanics, each acknowledging the magnitude of what had been rediscovered. Photographs of Whitman, rare, unsmiling images of a man more comfortable with tools than attention, were displayed alongside the aircraft. Those present felt the quiet power of a story reclaimed from obscurity. It was not just a celebration of a machine, but a recognition of a man who had paid the price of greatness with anonymity. His legacy, once lost, had finally stepped out of the shadows. Yet amid the renewed interest and the emotional closure it offered, one mystery remained unsolved. While cataloging the artifacts salvaged from the warehouse, archivists uncovered a crate stored near the prototype. It had never been opened, its markings faded but legible enough to suggest it belonged to the same project. The crate was sealed with reinforced bands, the metal hinges still intact despite decades of neglect. On its side, scratched faintly into the wood, was a name that now carried a weight it had never been granted in life: E. Whitman. And as the museum prepared to open the crate for the first time, a single question lingered in the air. What had Whitman hidden inside? A secret, untouched since the war's darkest hours. If stories like this one remind you that real heroes often live in the shadows, stay with us. There's so much more history waiting to be uncovered. Your support helps keep these forgotten truths alive for the next generation of seekers and storytellers. Share this journey with someone who still believes courage can come from the most unexpected places. And tell me, if you were in Whitman's place, would you fight for your legacy or let the world forget your name?